Happy New Year! Thank you for watching another video TA from Champion Briefs. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Lincoln Douglas Brief. Our latest edition has great topic analysis and research by coaches and former debaters, including Cheryl Kaczmarek and Adam Tomasi. Today I'm here to talk to you about the January and February topic, Resolved. Plea bargaining ought to be abolished in the United States criminal justice system. I like to start with defining the words in the topic. And to start, I always like to try and find the scope of the topic. In this case, it's what criminal justice system we're referring to, and that's the United States criminal justice system. So, questions about whether or not Canada's criminal justice system is good aren't really relevant, even necessarily on a counterplan level. I don't think we should be talking about other forms of plea bargaining. We only should be talking about plea bargaining as it exists in the United States. Now, plea bargaining exists on two different levels. It exists on a federal level and then also on a state level. How it functions on both levels is slightly different. On the state level, plea bargaining is basically an agreement between the prosecutor and the defendant about what a charge will be afterwards. On a federal level, the judge can actually say, I don't agree with this agreement, and say, I'm going to up the charge and make it a little bit higher and make your punishment higher. So, how we define the U.S. criminal justice system is going to be important, because if we define it as a federal only, state only, or state and federal, it changes how we will look at the debate and what is important within plea bargaining. So this can be advantageous if you want to have a couple of different strategies with regard to picks and things like that. So looking at the scope of the topic is always the first place to start. Next, I tend to go with abolished means to terminate, end, definitions like that. So that would mean that after the affirmative, there would be a world where there is no plea bargaining in the United States. It is gone. So like I said before, plea bargaining is basically an agreement in a criminal case between the prosecutor and a defendant, whereby the defendant agrees to plead guilty for a lower charge. In general, it's usually in return for a concession from the prosecutor. That's the lower charge, or maybe for lesser punishment under the same charge. So instead of looking at 10 to 20 years, a defendant may look at 5 to 10 years, things like that. So plea bargaining has been around in the United States since our founding, although it was generally frowned upon before the Civil War. After the Civil War, you begin to see more and more cases involving plea bargaining. In general, it's usually approved upon by the court system, and it's seen as something that happens. It's not necessarily a big deal until the turn of the 20th century. After the 1900s, you start to see a very sharp increase in the total number of plea bargains that occur. A lot of people attribute the rise of plea bargainings to increased corruption in police. And while this may be true, I'm not saying that there aren't police officers who took advantage of a lax system that allowed for coercion and corruption to occur. It definitely did, and there are well-documented cases of it happening. It's most likely that plea bargaining increased for the same reason we see it currently still increasing in the status quo, and that's that the criminal justice system has just been understaffed. And when I say the criminal justice system is understaffed, I mean that there are a shortage of three different things: judges, prosecutors, and defendants. And while there are plenty of people that go out and defend people in court, there are a lack of public defenders. And public defenders are those that actually take up the vast majority of cases within the criminal justice system. And they're supremely overworked. And so we're going to see a little bit later that this is probably the primary cause of most of the plea bargains that occur. In today's society, plea bargainings occur in at least 90% of federal cases and 90% of state and municipal cases, but there are some estimates out there that have shown it to be as high as 95%, and I've even read a few authors that talk about it being at close to 96 and 97%, although I tend to go with a little bit more of the lower numbers, because that seems to be where most of the literature lies, is somewhere between 90 and 95% for state and local cases. So when we start to look at the topic, we start to then see, well, obviously, if ought could imply a moral obligation, then our value should be morality, or We're talking about the justice system, so we should value probably justice or morality. And as we start to address the topic, this is a good time to think about what you've been really good at this year. Because in January and February, I wouldn't advise you to go too far outside of your comfort area and stick kind of with the arguments that you know best. This is the time of year with super important tournaments. There are a lot of TOC bid tournaments for those of you who debate on the circuit level. On the state level, I know a lot of different states have their state qualifiers and even their state tournaments in January and February. Some districts have their national qualifiers in January and February. So this is a really, really important topic on the year for a lot of different debaters. So I would kind of argue that this isn't the time to start experimenting with something new. This is the time to go with what you're good at and do it as best as you can. But this is also the time when you can start to begin to think about what camps you want to go to. At the Champions Brief Institute, where I personally work, we are a great camp because what we try and do is we emphasize individual attention. And so all of our staff members have the time to really give the students the attentions that you deserve. If you need to work on critiques, if you need to work on your judge adaptation, if you need to work on any number of things, the staff at Champion Briefs has the time to work with you on a one-to-one level. And that's because we keep things at a 4-to-1 student-to-staff ratio. That means that for every 4 students, there's always 1 staff member. So my time during the day at camp is devoted solely to working with you all to make sure that you get what you need out of camp. And under the leadership of the legendary Cheryl Kaczmarek, we've developed a great curriculum that can help students at all levels get to where they want to be and to unleash their champion. So when we start thinking about the debate round on the January-February topic, again, most of these rounds are probably going to be geared around morality and justice. That's because the topic obviously lends itself to those questions. It also opens itself up to a lot of different roles of the ballot about, for identity politics issues and things like that. Because the topic addresses such a broad system that deals with basically every single American. Every person in this country can deal with the criminal justice system at one point in their life. But some people have definitely dealt with it more than others, and probably because of structural issues that force the criminal justice system into those areas. So questions regarding how the criminal justice system deals with different populations within this country is going to be very, very important on the topic. I think one of the first areas to look at in it would be something along constitutionality. Does plea bargaining actually violate the Constitution? Well, the Supreme Court has ruled in the past that it doesn't violate the Constitution, but a lot of their justifications about why it doesn't violate the Constitution rest on arguments of judicial necessity. Now, some may argue that judicial necessity doesn't actually mean that something is necessarily constitutionally legal. It's just necessary to keep our criminal justice system going. There are a lot of authors out there who say that plea bargaining violates due process rights. So the first area that we can look at is saying plea bargaining is unconstitutional. Being unconstitutional fails to uphold any system of justice within the United States because the Constitution is the basis system of justice. I think this is probably one of the most basic affirmatives on the topic. I also think a judicial legitimacy affirmative is another one of those core topic cases. Judicial legitimacy affirmative would basically argue that plea bargaining is a corrupt tool within the system. And these kind of arguments are going to be the basis for a lot of different arguments that can pop up, but the simplest form of the argument is just that when we have a system that is open for corruption, the chance of it being there destroys the legitimacy of our judicial system. And judicial legitimacy is probably a critical element for the concept of justice, because if you don't have a legitimate justice system, you don't have justice. So this is kind of going to be a really key argument on a lot of different locales, and probably even on a national level. There are going to be a lot of debaters who read arguments about legitimacy and things like that. Another good affirmative could be something based on a Kantian principle of justice, because Kant would basically argue that crime can't go unpunished. You have to punish crime in some way, and the punishment for crime needs to be done in an objective manner, so that that punishment can't be different for different people. This type of argument would really, really be a good case that can have a lot of twists and turns in it, and could you can incorporate a lot of tricks into Kantian arguments, but I think it really functions well on plea bargaining, because plea bargaining creates subjective punishments for the same crime. Two people who murder someone in similar fashions, one person can be offered a plea, the other person may not be offered a plea, and that very offer of a plea makes the justice system subjective. And that destroys, obviously, first judicial legitimacy, but it also destroys the underpinnings of justice, because justice must be objective. So that would violate kind of Kantian principles. Some more progressive affirmatives may deal with issues like prison industrial complex and capitalism. What the prison industrial complex is an idea that private prisons have an interest and keeping more people in prison, because they get money every time people are in prison. And so more people in prison means more money for them. And plea bargaining is a tool to get more people in prison, potentially, because if more people went to jury trials, there's potential that there is actually less crime that occurs, and that there would be less, well, not less crime that occurs, but rather less crime that's actually convicted, less criminals that are convicted and sent to jail, because people psychologically don't actually want to send anybody to jail. And plea bargaining is basically a way to get, once you're in jail, there's a chance that you're going to stay in jail. It's recidivism. There's high recidivism rates. And so there are a lot of people that sit there and say that plea bargaining is just a tool by the capitalist state to get more people in jail, and how pleas function under capitalism. There's an incentive, and they've incentivized that. And even innocent people may think, wait a second, I don't want to go to trial, because in a trial, there's a jury. And even though juries may not want to send people to jail psychologically because they don't want to punish somebody, they also do send people to jail, and so maybe I don't want to go to jail, and so, or for as long, and so I'm going to take a lesser sentence and go to jail for 1 year instead of 5 years potentially, and so I take the lesser punishment that I know instead of take the risk that I get a greater punishment. And it's actually called, part of it is a prisoner's dilemma. It literally is. Do I tattle and take the lesser punishment and admit guilt and things like that? Or do I stay innocent and take a risk that I may get a greater punishment, but I also may be let off? So there are all sorts of things that occur. And moral questions and ways that you can address this and say that plea bargaining basically can incentivize corruption. Plea bargaining can incentivize innocent people to go to jail. And all of it does is gives money back into a prison industrial complex. There can also be cases that race plays a lot to do with pleas. There are a lot of studies out there that say that Black Americans have a greater chance, and actually not just Black Americans, but minority Americans in general, have a larger risk of being found guilty in jury trials. And it's mainly because juries are actually not made up of usually peers, which would be even racial peers. There's a racial disparity in juries, which tends to actually lead to racist sentencing. And this means that in general, there is a incentive for minority Americans to take a plea even when they're innocent, because there is a greater fear that they can be found guilty in front of a jury trial. And it incentivizes pleas. What it also incentivizes is prosecutors to increase charges potentially and overcharge for things, so that they scare defendants into pleading down to a lesser charge. So if I think that I can get somebody on, say, a gun possession charge, or let's say there's a person with a gun, but they also had drugs in the car, and they had a bunch of other things going on. I can tack on so many charges and minuscule charges so that suddenly if they're found guilty in a court of law, they're going to face 30 to 40 years. But if they take the plea, they're only getting 10 years. So corruption occurs not necessarily in a way of coercing, in like an overt coercion, and, like beating somebody into doing a plea deal and torturing them into accepting it, but rather by overcharging and really manipulating a person to plea to a lesser charge. I think there's also then, this kind of leads to one of the most basic negative arguments, I think, on the topic, and that's called the critical legal studies K. And that's a critique that says that the legal system basically doesn't work for anybody anymore. It's completely outdated. It doesn't work for the current world, and there needs to be a complete rethink of the criminal justice system and how we think about the criminal justice system in this country. So this is probably one of the first critiques that existed. And it still applies, and it can be used in a lot of different ways through a lot of different intersectional arguments that deal with how the court system doesn't work for a lot of different groups within this country. And I think that's a really, really good argument, and it's probably a true argument also in a lot of respects, and true arguments carry a lot of weight. So I always say go with an argument that's true, because true arguments are easy to convince judges, and one argument that says that the legal system has a lot of problems with it and needs total reform is probably an argument that a lot of judges can get behind. Another argument that's going to be really big, that's going to deal with a lot of judicial legitimacy questions as well, is going to be court clog. What happens when we get rid of plea bargaining? What happens to all of those 90 to 95% of cases out there that were pled out? Suddenly, they are now being tried. And when those cases are tried in a system that doesn't have enough judges, doesn't have enough defenders, and doesn't have enough prosecutors, cases are going to be delayed. They're going to be held back. And when cases take a very long time to prosecute, it begins to question the legitimacy of our criminal justice system. A lot of authors out there say that when our justice system gets backed up, not only does it hurt the legitimacy of our justice system, but it also can lead to many real-world bad impacts, right? If court cases aren't heard about environmental issues because there's a clog within the court system and judges can't hear these cases, then there are environmental problems that can occur. There are so many different areas where court clog can prevent litigation from happening that saves lives. So court clog is a big argument that's going to be run on the negative. Another really big argument is going to be anything involving politics. Anytime you talk about reforming the criminal justice system, politics is going to play a key role. And anytime that you're talking about politics, there are so many different scenarios that can come up. So we always, in my teams, I've always taught them that one of the best things that you can do is have arguments on both sides about your popularity. And there are a lot of authors that talk about plea bargaining being an unpopular part of the criminal justice system. And there are authors that talk about it being a very popular part of the justice system. So politics is always going to play a role in it. And on this issue in particular, it definitely goes both ways. I think a more interesting and nuanced negative approach could be arguing something along the lines of a virtue ethics argument. And in virtue ethics, you basically say that getting rid of plea bargaining would increase retributive justice, which, by the way, I think would be a great framework on the affirmative, is a retributive justice framework, or rather, yeah, on the affirmative, is a great framework because getting rid of plea bargaining basically forces actually the punishment that is listed for the crime. Virtue ethics would say that that's a bad way to treat criminals and that we need to have a rehabilitative justice system. And plea bargaining is a way to have a rehabilitative, forgiving justice system where people get punished, but they're also helped back into society. And plea bargaining is a first step in that kind of virtuous manner of rehabilitating and saying, you did wrong, but we're going to let you off a little bit easier and show mercy, because that's what a good society does. Finally, I think there's a lot of counterplan ground on this topic, and I think there's also a lot of argument about where it can come from, this argument. Is it a federal program? You know, if it's the federal mandate to get rid of plea bargaining, there are going to be a lot of states who are angry. So I think federalism arguments are going to be important. I think it's also important that we talk about things like sentencing reform and stuff like that on the negative, because if there's such an overloaded criminal justice system that requires so many pleas, maybe we need to unload the criminal justice system and change how we sentence different crimes. And maybe certain things that are felonies really should be misdemeanors and shouldn't have to be loading the criminal justice system. And, you know, one of the biggest ones would have to be on a drug reform counterplan that a lot of people are running out there. You know, drug reform counterplans, I wouldn't necessarily run them in front of everybody because there are some people out there that still really view, these kind of issues as a criminal issue. But the drug reform counterplan would say that we need to treat things like marijuana and cocaine and heroin and opioids and all of these things that we hear in the news all the time about as medical issues, and that we shouldn't be putting them in the criminal justice system. We should be getting medical treatment for these people. And that would potentially alleviate some aspects of the criminal justice system, because now people aren't going to be punished by going to jail. They're punished in different ways, in ways like, you know, forced into probation and things like that, that avoids court sentencing a lot of times. And then I also think on the negative, there's a good justification to just say, you know what? There's no way that the state can fix this. This is a problem inherent within the state. The state is always corrupt, and we need to reject the state. And that's your traditional state bad NC. Even if we reform this one element in plea bargaining, there are so many other problems within the state that exist that, like, this is a drop in the bucket. And that we need to just be rejecting the state as a whole. And, you know, saying by getting rid of the plea bargaining the state is solved is not a good way to do it. You know, we need to actually reject the state as a whole, and that would be a state bad NC. I think there's also some arguments out there about why plea bargaining may be a good thing when it comes to how police function in investigations, right? You know, you have potentially lower level suspects within criminal organizations who will plea down to even lower charges so that they can give up the bigger fish, so to speak, within the organization and get law enforcement to where they actually need to be. You know, it's the whole cut off the head of the snake thing. You keep cutting off the tail and keep growing back. So if we can get lower level people to give up these higher level criminals through pleas, it's probably a good thing. There's also questions about whether or not plea bargaining may be necessary on national security justifications, and why there's maybe incentive for national security reasons to have plea bargains. So there's a lot of arguments on both sides about why plea bargaining may be good or bad, why it's justified, why it is just, why it may be unjust. The topic has some decent balance to it, although I would say that the negative may have a slight edge when it comes to impacts to an impact level debate with some bigger impact arguments. And I think the negative may also have a slight edge on the counterplan level debate. So for affirmatives, I'd argue that you all need to be very well prepared against picks, because this topic definitely lends itself to a lot of different picks out there. And I also think that a lot of different Ks on this topic could go on bidirectional argumentation, and a lot of different critiques can be justified on the AF and saying that this is a first step on the K. So perm ground for the AF on the K is probably pretty good. But overall, this topic is decently balanced, I'd say. And I think that it is probably one that's a little bit more relevant in today's society than we think it is. When you really look at the overall number of plea bargains that occur in cases in the United States, it's staggering. And it makes us wonder, how often is law and order really accurate? That doesn't happen very often. Those cases probably don't exist as much as we think, because it seems to me that most of the cases that get to trial on TV probably are plead out in real life. So I urge you all to do some good research on this topic, and a good way to start would be to check out some of the briefs that we have created here at Champions Briefs. We talk about a lot of the arguments that I listed and a few more that I did not talk about. And it's always a good place to start on the reading, because the topic analysis that are done by Shankar and all of our writers are really great. So I urge you all to check out the brief for January and February. Try and learn the most you can on this topic, and good luck in January and February. Thank you very much.